Hello, everyone who is joining us, and welcome back to another stream. And today we have with us Eamon, who leads solutions engineering at Thirdweb. And Eamon is here to talk about Nebula. So, Nebula is this new toolkit which helps you build AI agents on blockchain, and it's built very critically and very thoughtfully to create blockchain specific AI agents or blockchain specific AI apps. So, Eamon is the expert over here. So, I will let him talk about Nebula and talk a little bit about himself as well. So, Eamon, why don't you give all of us a little bit introduction about yourself? What's your background has been? How did you end up in this industry? What was your background before this? Like, how do you help people integrate and use third web products? And of course, like, why should someone building in the AI space or blockchain space or at the intersection of AI and blockchain space should care about Nebula and everything about Nebula, basically? So I will pass it on to you, Eamon, and just enlighten us about Nebula.
Thanks. Thanks, Sahil. Very, very nice to be here and welcome everybody. Yes, so my name is Ayman Abdelmonem. I lead the solutions team at Thirdweb. The simplest way that I would describe what we as a team, our job is, so Thirdweb is a hotel. We work with developers of, indie developers, organizations, projects who are trying to build on EVM blockchains. And we provide a whole full stack of tools there, everything from front-end SDKs to wallets to payment on-ramps to bridging and swapping to also infrastructure and services that folks can use when you're building an app. And so there's a lot of tools. And so what my team's job is really to be your concierge in the Thirdweb hotel. So teams that are getting started with Thirdweb who have ideas about what they want to do on chain, my team's job is to essentially help them architect their solutions and also pick from the a la carte menu of tools and services that we provide at Thirdweb. On the personal front, Sahil, since you asked about it, I've been with Thirdweb for 3+ years, which means that I've had a front row seat. One of the things I love about my job is I have a front row seat with like all of the kind of coolest projects that are out there and over the years. And so I've seen a lot and worked with a lot of teams. And so that's what I love about my job. And when we started and launched Nebula, really it was based of a belief that we have as a company that in the same way that like we have developers and we've given tools for developers to be able to easily onboard and access blockchains, that in a world in which folks are going to be building AI agents and other AI based applications, that essentially we needed tools, we'll call them, and infrastructure that those AI agents themselves could use to interact with, to read and write with those blockchains. And so, that's what inspired us and to work very, very hard earlier this year to launch Nebula, which we're going to talk about today. Nebula today is in early access, and we're working very, very hard, over the next weeks and, hopefully next month to be able to make this publicly available for anybody who wants to use Nebula.
I have joined the early access devs telegram of Nebula already, and I see that people are already getting excited about using Nebula, and a lot of people are already using that, testing it, breaking it down. Maybe probably I'll ask you this towards the end, but I will also love to get some interesting use cases which people have already built using Nebula, but maybe towards the end. But just came into my mind, so I thought of sharing that.
Let me dive in a little bit into what Nebula is. I think those of us who have been in Web3 for a while might be very, very familiar with the famous Chris Dixon line about, in general, about blockchain and saying it's about, read, write, and own, right? That's the real sort of thing about decentralization and what blockchain unlocks. And for us, Nebula is about read, write, and reason on chain. And so what do we mean by that? So what is Nebula and how does Nebula work? So you can think of Nebula, fundamentally at its core, what Nebula is at the center of it is a reasoning module, a model actually we call T1. So Nebula itself is an LLM, which is, one of the things I think, first and foremost, kind of like, to just say, which maybe differentiates it with blockchain or AI agent frameworks or tools that are out there. At its Nebula is a model itself, and it's a model that has been trained on over the 3,000 EVM chains that we at Thirdweb have access to. So think about those chains, think about the smart contracts deployed to those chains, think about the ABIs on those chains, think about code snippets and other things that we at Thirdweb that we have. All of that has gone into a fine-tuned T1 model that understands blockchain, understands smart contracts, understands ABIs and protocols. So that's the reason piece. And then the model also has access to read capabilities, and that's the read piece of read, write, and reason, give access to live and historical blockchain data. So it's the ability to be able to kind of read directly onto a blockchain to read transactions, contract states, token prices, the things that you see here. And then write is about creating a execution framework or an execution agent you can think of built into Nebula that allows for actually performing transactions directly using natural language. You can prompt and send that to Nebula, and Nebula can actually perform transactions on chain, either with local wallets that you have access to or via other mechanisms like, those who are familiar with smart wallets and session keys and other things. So we're expanding the capabilities here around execution. These are the components of Nebula. Did you have a question,
Yeah.
Sahil?
Yeah, yeah, Iman. So I just had a very silly question. Maybe it's a very silly question. So you said that there's a reasoning part, which is a new LLM built in-house, running under the hood in the Nebula framework toolkit, which you are calling T1 model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just had this question that there are already traditional or generic LLM providers like Anthropic, OpenAI, right? A lot of people are using them in their agent kits or their agent frameworks. So just wanted to ask that why was the decision or what was the design thinking behind creating a new LLM model altogether from scratch, and why was this integrated into Nebula, and why a new model altogether? Oh,
Yeah.
there it is. Already, you already have
Yeah,
it. Okay.
no, that's a great question. It's a great question, right? And you're absolutely true. You can go to these general LLMs and you can absolutely ask it about things on chain. Prompt it with questions related to blockchain. But I think the real differentiator and why we think Nebula needs to exist is what you see in this table here, right? It's the difference between let's say parsing websites, let's say like Etherscan and others, versus actually having the ability to actually in real time be able to invoke, read from contracts, read from chains, read from blocks on that chain, right? So that's kind of one big differentiator and, of what differentiates Nebula from a generic LLM. Also, it's having access to all the chains, right? So, the proliferation of L1s, L2s, we even see L3s now, right? And so getting and making sure that it's comprehensive and then being able to support contract executions. We think that that's going to be a really, really key part of a world in which, blockchains and crypto can really be like a financial backbone for AI agent economies. And so, being
Got
able
it.
to support wallets and be able to support different models, and permissioning and other things around those executions to make it so that these agents can perform in a controlled fashion.
Got it. So in a way, these generic LLMs, you can say, are like supermarkets where yes, you can get coffee, but the Nebula T1 model is like a specialized coffee shop where it focuses on making good coffee and types of coffee. For example, yes, generic LLMs can get you blockchain data or data related to blockchain, but Nebula understands blockchain data, and it understands blockchain data out of the box, and it already has data from like what 2,500 plus chains, and can understand ABIs, can understand contracts, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at a flow like this, Sahil, maybe it helps, right? Like a simple query, which you can do on, I believe, on a general LLM, which is like, what is the current price of ETH? Let's say
Mhm.
that's the prompt, right? Now, what happens in Nebula? So, to kind of differentiate, right, is that what Nebula does is that what Nebula do is that Nebula will actually query on-chain DEX contracts for the ETH price, right? Will fetch the price. And then this is a really, really important part. It doesn't just return it, but it also, there's validation that's going to happen of the price, right? Maybe with pricing, it might not be as obvious in terms of like, well, what kind of validation do you need to do, right? I can just go to, their APIs out there. But like, imagine that this, instead of this being the price of ETH, imagine that this was an ABI or a contract call, right? And so, you're about to perform a transaction. Well, you want to validate, or you want to, do things like build the transaction, simulate the transaction, validate that it's a valid transaction before returning it, let's say, to the agent so that the agent executes it, right? That in a nutshell is Nebula.
It's a truly on-chain model. Like it queries on-chain data, it queries on-chain contracts rather than querying websites or databases where that data is stored. Understood.
Exactly. So, and this is what I talked about, right? So that's the execute. So again, it's like Nebula is the LLM. It has this reasoning capabilities with read and write, and we think it's really, really powerful. And also, I think, Sahil, honestly, the best way is like for me to stop, showing a PowerPoint and to actually like, why don't we just dive in? All right. So now Nebula is an API. I want to say that from the get-go, right? And so what we realized in releasing Nebula is that, like all of us probably do, is like before you start using an LLM in your application, you want to have like a chat interface. You want to get to know your LLM, right?
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to do here is just kind of give people a sense of like, get to know Nebula. People who are in our early access today also get access to what is called our playground, right? And this is just an example of an application that has been built on Nebula's APIs. And so what I'm going to do here is just kind of walk you through like a session that I had with Nebula. So you can see here that I can just ask general questions about any of the chains, right? And I get some information here about, tell me about Arbitrum mainnets, and it'll tell me about Arbitrum, information about what is it, a layer 1 or is it a layer 2, its native currency and other things. Now I ask, well, what is the address of USDC on Arbitrum mainnet? And this is really kind of, might seem like a simple query, but this is a great example of our ability to be able to, because we've fine-tuned the model to, with like actual smart contracts that have been deployed on these and the contract metadata associated with these smart contracts, like you can perform queries like this in which you kind of use the name of a contract on a chain, and Nebula is able to resolve that. And so it does that. Then I want to do a read. So I said, well, what is the total supply? And so what Nebula does is it goes and it actually performs a real-time read on the contract, does it, calls the supply function on the ERC20 and gets what the total supply is. I can get the current gas price on Arbitrum mainnet. This is a fun one. How much USDC on Arbitrum does my wallet own? Right? Well, how does it know about my wallet? Well, this context to the right is where that's being set, right? So I've connected to this playground with a wallet, and this is my wallet address. But like this allows me essentially to send context, and you can do this programmatically with Nebula, to be able to send like context so that when you say something like my wallet or the chain or the chains, right? If I pass, I can pass chain IDs, I can pass like wallet address, and Nebula is able to, to do that. And so it tells me, well, I don't own any USDC on Arbitrum in my wallet. And then I query blocks. I can create transactions within that block. I can even like go and then take the transactions and say, show me the transaction details. And right, and it goes and it tells me, and it gives me the transaction hash. It tells me the block number, right? The to and the from and other information, in terms of, it's even showing me like emitted events that were generated by that transaction.
And I think, Eamon, this is a very good example of the difference between Nebula and those generic LLMs, where, yes, with generic LLMs, you would be able to get USDC on Arbitrum's address because they might scrape some websites, etc. But they might not be able to get the total supply of that token. They might not be able to get recent block transactions, etc. So on that thing,
Exactly.
I have a follow up question on that, Amen. So
Yes.
this data which Nebula is giving us, is that fed into Nebula via a indexer, or Nebula is making like live calls to the blockchain to get this data?
It is making live calls to the blockchain to get this data.
Oh, very cool.
So I wanted to show a fun one actually, because like those are, those are maybe like simple prompts that you want to do. But again, this is an LLM, and maybe, a fun example that I wanted to show is maybe like an example of maybe an app someone would want to build, right? So what
Yeah.
I did is like many people probably on this live stream, I get a bunch of newsletters, about different, talking about different meme coins and other things. And I was sort of like, maybe be like a cool app someone should build where it's like, take like an email newsletter and then auto generate like a market analysis report for the tokens that are being referenced in the article. And so what I've done is I've actually, in here, I'm going to, have kind of a more sophisticated prompt now, the kind of thing that many of us have done, like, just using other LLMs. I'm going to give it instructions. I'm going to give you an excerpt from a newsletter, and I want you to analyze the text. And if any cryptocurrencies or tokens are mentioned, I want you to look up the current price and give me a market analysis. And then here's the text. And this was, I think I took it from like a Milk Road or something, talking about Dogecoin. So yeah, so if I'm going to go ahead and send that here. Okay, and so now that query has been sent to Nebula. Now it's going to take a little bit of time to think about this. I
Mhm.
mentioned at the beginning that we are in early access, and so we've what we're focused on first and foremost is accuracy, and accuracy over speed at this time. And so we wanted to first make sure that we get accurate answers coming out of the model, and then obviously we can then turn around and optimize then for speed. So you'll see that if you're using Nebula, that Nebula does here what it's kind of rendering in the UI is it's doing a lot of thinking. Now, I mean, it's doing more than thinking on the back end. So a lot of the things that I mentioned to you, Sahil, like you can see here now, like it's executing some things. And so here it's given like a, here's its kind of Dogecoin market analysis, right? And it gives a price
Yeah.
overview, market dynamics, and some key observations. If I want to give Nebula a voice, I can do that. I could say, you know what, can you like report this, but do it like you're Jim Cramer on CNBC. And like you can do with any other LLM. Really, I
Yeah.
show this both as a fun example, but also just to so that people understand that Nebula itself is an LLM and can be used like an LLM. In fact, like if people are just using like OpenAI's libraries directly, Nebula supports OpenAI's chat completions API, and so you can literally
Correct.
just like reference Nebula with your Thirdweb secret key, and you'd be able to use it. So you can kind of see here that Nebula, gave. Well, what was the advice? Be careful. That's probably good advice when it comes to that.
And Ayman, is Nebula connected to web? Does it have access to web as well?
It does. That's what I mean when I said that, like when you were looking at the, when it was saying thinking. And I think we're going to work on, providing better feedback back to people who are calling the API, just so that you can
Mhm.
kind of know, like, what are the step-by-step things. I think if anyone has used some of the thinking LLMs that are out there that sort of show you like what it's thinking about and what it's doing, I think
Yeah.
we, especially for some of these longer things, we would like to do that. I wanted to show one more here, Sahil. Like I want to
Mhm.
show execution, right? And so I
Yeah.
want to also perform like this as the prompt, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say to it, like, check the amount of Sepolia ETH in my wallet. And if it's greater than 1 ETH, I want to transfer zero point 0.5 of it to this wallet address. So when I send this transaction, so what this is an example of the write that we were talking about, or the execute.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that wallet address could have been ENS or some domain as well?
That is correct. That is correct.
Okay,
I
nice.
can, it does understand ENS. Um, and so what's going to happen here, and what we do in our playground is because I'm connected with a wallet, so what Nebula is doing right now is it's going to check the balance in the wallet, right? It's going to, get back those results. It's going to check obviously the condition to see, well, how much, ETH, do I own in there? If
Yeah,
it meets the condition, then it's going to build the transfer transaction and then send that back to me. And so what should happen here is I will get prompted actually with a transaction button that I'll be able to click right now and actually perform the transaction, right? So I'm
understood.
I've I've said to Nebula, my wallet is connected, so send back to me the transaction. Oh, oh,
Oh,
darn
okay.
it. Oh gosh, I picked the wrong wallet. Go, you were gonna ask the question, Sahil.
I was going to ask that in the context window, you have set your wallet address, right? So just
Yes.
wanted to understand that how does Nebula performs the transaction signing part, because that will require your private key or access to your private key, right?
Yeah, so in this case, the context here isn't used for the execution transaction, right? So when
Okay.
you, and this gets into the API of Nebula. So in Nebula, when you make a call to the API, we have like there's an execution mode that you tell it, okay? And so
Hmm.
one of those modes is something called client. What client
Got it.
mode means is it means that the signing wallet is on the client. All you do is you encode the transaction on your side and then pass it back to me. And then it's the responsibility of the client to then sign and send the transaction. So let me try a different, let's deploy a new ERC20 contract. I'm
Yeah.
deploying a new ERC contract to Sepolia and call it Quick Workshop. And so here you can see that it basically passes back this transaction. And what execute transaction then allows me to do is it allows me to then it's going to prompt my connected wallet to approve this transaction.
Understood. Yeah,
And then
it's
so the
very.
transaction has been sent. And then, once it's confirmed, then you would see the confirmed transaction here. All right, this is the transaction hash, but we could also
Mhm.
view that on the Explorer, right? So you can see here is my wallet address, and here's the transaction that got sent. So then what I would do is to actually look at building with it, right? Now
An
that we've
app.
gotten,
Yeah.
yeah, kind of building an app. Things
Amen.
like,
Before that,
yeah, go ahead.
I had one another question. Sorry for asking too many questions, by the way, but I promise this will be the last question, probably from my side. So I have this question that there are bunch of agent kits out there. This we already talked about the LLM part. There are generic LLMs, there are traditional LLMs, but then there is highly contextual, specific to blockchain model T1. But in case of Nebula, as a toolkit or a framework, like there are a lot of agent kits already out there, right? Like Coinbase
Mhm.
has one. There's one called Goat, which has a bunch of blockchain integrations, etc. So what makes Nebula stand out, or why should someone use Nebula instead of those agent kits, and why Nebula compared to the agent kits already out there?
Nebula is compatible with all of the agent kits that are out there and
Oh,
could
okay.
be used. So, for example, and the example that I'm going
Eliza.
to show, for example, was me building it using Eliza's AI agent toolkit.
Mhm.
But you can folks who are building using, I mentioned the fact that if you're using open AI libraries, you can use Nebula directly. Really, what our vision with Nebula would be that we would have plugins or integrations with many, if not all of the various agent kits, or for developers themselves to be able to build their own, plugins to their agent kit of choice that
Mhm.
would leverage a Nebula. So that would be the first thing that I would say, that it's not about using Nebula instead of other agent
Okay.
frameworks that are out there. It's more that much of what I said at the beginning, which was that what maybe makes it different is that Nebula itself is a foundational model with abilities to read and write to the blockchain. And so you can think of it as a tool when you're building an AI agent, and let's say you're building in a game or something like that. What would be, you can think of Nebula as a tool, as you would other tools that could be used, in stitching together, the job to be done by your agent. I just wanted to, show one thing here, which is that, I showed you a chat interface that was just showing like kind of like natural language prompt response. But a lot of times when you're building an application or you're integrating, what you want to do is you want to get structured data back. And what I just wanted to show here, just in Postman, I'm not gonna, I don't have to run this and I don't have to belabor it, but when you query and I'm querying, I can also tell it I want a JSON schema. I want the answer to conform to a JSON schema that I will provide. You can provide that JSON schema as part of the payload that you're sending. And so what you'll get back is in the response, you'll see here that the message that came back, right, is just the formatted JSON that I sent, which in this particular case, the query that I'm asking had to do with like, give me the tokens. I wanted that token to be essentially in like an array in the JSON that I can then read in my application. Just wanted to point that out to developers. With that, what I want to do here is share with you a fun little app that I built, right? So it was an event recommender, right? So maybe people went to ETH Denver last week. So the idea of it was I built an ELIZA agent that would interact with a user on Twitter. And the goal is, agent, you need to get the ENS or wallet address from the user. And then from there, you need to take the action of finding matching events. Okay. And so what is finding matching events? So what finding matching events is like, I've gotten Vitalik.eth. I need to get the tokens owned using Nebula, right? I need to get the side events. So I have a little database of side events at ETH Denver, right? And then basically pass both of these into an LLM and say, hey, find matching events based off of this sort of criteria, right? And I gave it a prompt to essentially find matching events. And that then is what is returned to the user. Okay, that I call event recommender. So we can actually run it. Right, so what I'll do here is, because I actually modified the client here to just use a direct. So I'm just going to chat with it directly versus me having to switch between Twitter and here and Twitter and here so that you could see it. So I'm starting up my ELIZA agent here.
Yeah, something like this will be very useful for like everyone going to events, because there are like the amount of events right now are just out of hands.
So I said, so I said hello, and then the agent came back and it said, hello, welcome to ETH Denver side events concierge service. I'm here to help you discover the best side events. Could you please share your ENS name or Ethereum wallet address? Okay, this is my ENS. Okay, all right. So now it's going to start doing work. So you can see here that it's saying getting recommendations for mayamin.eth, right? So it's detected. It's now kicked off the action, which is calling out to Nebula. And I can actually kind of show that here. So you can see here, this is just like the server log. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we're just looking at the server log, right? So it fetched from AMN.eth. It found 3 active chains, 4 tokens, didn't find any NFTs. So now it's basically it's running the matching here. Okay. And then once this is done, we can go back to ELIZA, and it generated 5 recommendations. Okay. So if we go back, right, here's the agent. Thank you for sharing your ENS name. This will just take a moment. Here are the events I found for today, right? And here are the events, right? And you'll notice there's like a little bit of a reason here, right?
Yeah.
So it's meant to be like, an attempt to like looking at the kinds of tokens and other things that I hold to try to like find things I would find interesting.
Interesting. Yes.
And I cheated a little bit, I cheated a little bit. One of the prompts I told them, I said, always tell them about the Thirdweb event. So, but again, hey, it's good to
Yeah,
know. It's good to know that the AI agent that I built is listening to me. And didn't, and didn't decide to go off and do something else. So that's
until
it.
now.
Yeah, until now, exactly. So now we look at like it, right? So here's kind of like, just kind of showing you a little bit of the code, right? That like, here's the action in my ELIZA called find matching events.
Mhm.
Um, it checks to see if an address or an ENS is in the context of the conversation. And if so, then it's performing the fetch, right? So it's calling essentially just like a little service so I have a little like API service that the agent is hitting that is going to call, essentially like calls Nebula. And here's that JSON format that it basically is going to, it's going to call the Nebula API endpoint, using my secret key. Basically, what I wanted is I want the wallet address, an ENS domain, and then an array by chain that tells me
Mhm.
like what are the ERC20s that are owned, what NFTs are owned, and it does that like for each chain that's in my wallet, which is also why that query takes a little bit of time because it's doing a query across many chains to find that. And then once that returns, that's what's returned to the user.
That's very cool example because everyone keeps on talking about use cases of AI agents where you can swap, where you can send transactions, where you can do some kind of DeFi activity, but something like this where you can have good combination of crypto plus real world things is a very nice example.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, yeah. And again, you can with Nebula, as you saw with a lot of the AI agent activity right now in Web3 is focused around kind of DeFi and trading. And
Yeah.
like I showed with some of the prompts, I mean, your ability to be able to like look at a wallet, look at a wallet's contents, being able to like read transactions or blocks, being able to like listen to like smart contracts, right? These are all things, being able to like do transfers or to perform transactions, right? You can do all of those things with Nebula. So, folks who are building DeFi apps should definitely consider Nebula. People who are building games, also, you could think about a character in a game, a shopkeeper who, let's say negotiates with a user, right, and sells them an NFT sword or something like that. But, in the same way that, I kind of, if someone's wearing a Rolex, Sahil, like you, rolling around with a Rolex, I might, if I'm in like a traditional market, like, in certain parts of the world, and I see a person looks like he's a foreigner or looks like she might be like, she has a Gucci bag, then I might, the price for the carpet might be 2x
Yeah.
what I might charge somebody who, who comes in looking like Amen, So, um, you can do some pretty fun things like with game characters as well using Nebula.
100%. I mean, the thing is that the use cases and applications are endless. It just depends on the devs' creativity and thinking capability, right? Because it has access to blockchain. It's a model of its own. So yeah, and plus you can basically, as you mentioned earlier, you can basically integrate it or use it with other SDKs kits already out there. So yeah, I would say the use cases are endless. There are tons of things which can be built. And Amen, there are questions from Ginagong, and they asked that does Nebula have a token?
So Nebula,
Everyone wants to know about tokens, right? Like even before it's launched on.
not that Nebula has told me, itself. No, but no. So there is no Nebula token associated
Yeah.
with Nebula. And by the way, I would be amiss, Sahil. I should have mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Like I mentioned the fact that there's early access, and there's still opportunities for people to join our early access. So anyone who's out there, all they have to do is if you go to thirdweb.com/Nebula, you will see
Mhm.
their form that would allow you to apply to get early access. And we are definitely looking for folks, more folks to join. So I encourage folks who are listening to go to thirdweb.com/nebula and to, get themselves on the early access list. And, we're kind of opening it up like on a daily basis to
Yeah,
users. So,
100%.
you'll be able to get in.
Not just the access, but you will also get in the community of builders who are building on Nebula. So you will get support from community, you'll get support from the Third Web's team, and who knows? I mean, you can get your co-founder in that community. So highly recommend to join the waitlist.
Yeah, and
And
we do have a Telegram group for the early access folks as well, right? So that people can see what other people are building, ask questions. Myself, I'm in that Telegram. Other folks from our customer success team, and then also Furkan, our co-founder, our CTO, they are in there as well. So we'd love to see folks in there.
there are two more like questions from the same person, Ayman. The
Yes,
another one is the waitlist open? So yes, waitlist is open. You
it
can
is.
just go to thirdweb.com/nebula and fill out the form to get added to the queue, and you will be whitelisted pretty soon. And you can also check the link which is prompted on the screen right now. And there is another question from the same person, Ayman, and they asked that it looks like there are more than one Nebula AI. I think they got confused between the different use cases which you showed. Maybe they got confused that Nebula has multiple AIs, but the thing is that Ayman showed multiple use cases built on top of Nebula or built using Nebula. So
Yeah.
Nebula is a model, but the things which we saw, the tools which we saw, were the different use cases or apps built using Nebula.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's sort of like in the same way. Like so, it's natural, especially with folks being so used to Chat GPT, to think of the product as being that chat.
Yes.
And our playground is a chat application, but Nebula is a service that both that playground that I was showing you was using, and that also that event recommender Eliza agent that I showed you was also using, right? They were both using the exact same API, using the exact same, functions that are available there. So really, like Nebula, as you can see in this diagram here, right, is the API. And it's really meant to be, this is where your apps are, right? Your apps are up here, your apps use this, and we want to see more and more people building with Nebula.
For folks who are watching this on YouTube after this has been uploaded as a normal video, you can still ask questions if you get any questions after watching the video about Nebula, about Third Web. Feel free to drop those questions in the comment section, and we will make sure to get those questions answered by the Third Web team. We will forward those questions to the Third Web team, and they'll be happy to answer those questions. And on the closing note, make sure to check out Nebula. You can check the link which is being prompted on the screen, thirdweb.com/nebula. And thank you so much, Ayman, for doing this. Thank you so much for coming and talking about Nebula, educating us about Nebula, and showing us how awesome Nebula is
Thank
and
you
how
so
awesome
much,
you are.
Sahil. Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, and looking forward to a part two, in the not too distant future.
100%, 100%. Let's build something like really cool using Nebula in the
Awesome.
future.
Love it.
All
Love
right.
it. It
Thank you
was
so much,
great.
everyone, for
Thank you.
joining.